Everyone. Sorry, I heard it was informal this morning, so I'm not wearing a jacket. But we are ending something and beginning something. We are ending the book of Exodus, the book of Shemot, and beginning the book of Vayikra. And also this morning is Rosh Chodesh. So I want to wish you all a happy month. This month is the month of Purim, of Adar. And I hope that it proves to be a joyous month for all of you. The issue that I'd like to deal with today is something that I touch on in the Jerusalem Post Torah column that I write, but also is going to be broader than I'm actually able to explore it in print. And that begins with the story that you read about at the very end of the book of Exodus, when it says, when Moses had finished the work, that is on the tabernacle, and it says the cloud, I'm now reading from chapter 40, verse 34. If you want to follow in the book of Exodus, chapter 40, verse 34. The cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the presence of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses couldn't enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the presence of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Now, here's one of the things that is interesting about this is that if Moses couldn't enter because the presence of God filled the tabernacle, then that suggests in some way that the presence of God is a physical thing that you can't enter. And second, what is the relationship of the cloud and the presence of God? So there are three different directions you can go, and they represent in some ways different ideas of how we conceive of God, which is really what I'm going to talk about this morning. One way of thinking about it is that God is in some way a real physical presence. Obviously, the vast majority of the Jewish thought has rejected that idea. And you may be surprised that I say the vast majority. Have there been Jewish thinkers that have entertained the possibility that in some way God has a physical presence? There have been. And if you read the Torah itself, God has a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and God has a back, and on and on. It suggests a physical presence. But the overwhelming consensus in Jewish teaching literature, the rabbis, certainly the philosophers, is that these are physical words that are used only because we don't have any other words to use to describe God's presence. And therefore, even though we talk about God in physical ways, Jews believe in a non-physical God, a non-tangible God, something that you cannot see or touch or smell. I didn't say hear because God can be heard, but it's not tangible the same way. So that's one interpretation of the possibility of the cloud in the tabernacle. And it's one that is suggested by some commentators, but as I said, does not really accord with Jewish belief. The second is that Moses couldn't go in there just because God's presence gave it an overwhelming sense of holiness, and Moses shrunk away from that. And that we could certainly understand. There, God's presence is manifested in the human reaction to God's presence. So it's what you feel when you're in God's presence that moves you. The question, of course, remains, how can God be more present in some places than others? And this subdivides the question into, for some people, God's presence is a function of human openness and receptivity. And what the tabernacle did was it enabled some people to feel closer to God, especially Moses, and therefore, overwhelmed by the sense that he is closer to God, he couldn't actually enter at that moment. For others, God, in some way we don't understand, has a more concentrated presence in this world, not in a physical sense, but in a spiritual sense than in other places. And although it's very hard to wrap your head around, and I'm not sure this is one of those things that can be rationally accounted for very easily, we understand intuitively what that means because we feel differences in different spaces. When you walk into some churches, mosques, synagogues, other spaces of worship, you sometimes feel a sense of genuine holiness. And you know that the air is the same as the air outside, but it doesn't feel that way. In the same way that when you walk into your own house, the air inside your house feels different somehow, more, I guess is the only way to put it. It feels like yours. And it feels as though you could shut your eyes and they could put you in 5 different rooms, and when they put you in your own home, you would know. So the notion that God has different concentrations of presence at different times in different ways, even though seemingly counterintuitive, in another way, really is in accord with what we experience in the world. And then there is a third possibility that I want to raise that I think is really intriguing and suggestive. That is, we're not going to exhaust its possibilities by talking about it now. And that is that the cloud represents a certain kind of mystery. Clouds themselves are mysterious in a way. They're sometimes in the sky and then they dissipate. They can be dark, they can be light. Rain comes out of them, which again is mysterious in a certain sense, even if there's a scientific explanation. They take on the shapes of things in the world. And in the Bible, remember that it is a cloud during the day that leads the Israelites forward, and the rabbis ascribe all sorts of miracles to the clouds. It was the cloud that blocked the weapons at the sea when the Egyptians were firing their arrows. Probably didn't occur to you that Egyptians were probably firing arrows as they were going, as the Israelites were walking through the sea. How did that not hit them? It occurred to the rabbis. The cloud blocked the arrows. A voice of God comes from within the cloud to the people to have them follow. Those sorts of miracles are, I think, products of the reality that a cloud feels so inexplicable and mysterious. And to have God's presence represented by the cloud is not, as in the first interpretation, a suggestion that it is physical, or in the second interpretation, a suggestion that it is purely emotional in the individual, him or herself, but rather it is a way of saying that there is an ultimate sort of shape-shifting, constantly mobile mystery to what God is and how God is that is impossible to understand without imagery. And when we talk about God, all of our God language has to be metaphorical because we're talking about something that we don't understand and that doesn't actually enter into the normative human experience. So we can only speak about God with metaphors, and metaphors are ways of using things that we do know to explain things that we don't know. So if I tell you, try this fruit, you've never had it, but it tastes a little bit like a cross between, I don't know, a lime and a kiwi, whatever. The point is, I've used the lime and kiwi, which you do know, in order to give you some sense of this which you don't know. And that's what the cloud is supposed to do for us with God. Is here is something that is very close, that you have experience of, but that is ultimately mysterious to you. And that this ends the book of Exodus is in some ways a very good setup for the book that comes after, Vayikra, Leviticus, because it reminds us that creating mechanisms by which we can reach towards that God, which is what Leviticus does. I mean, the priests and the tabernacle and the rites and so on, they're all ways of creating a kind of a land bridge between the human spirit and the divine. All of those things are required because ultimately God is this, what a medieval Christian mystic, Thomas à Kempis, called a cloud of unknowing, or was it Julian of Norwich? Anyway, a cloud of unknowing. And that's what we find here at the very end of the book of Exodus, is this impossibility of really understanding or coming to grips with who God is, what God is, and even how God is. It says, when the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out on their various journeys. But if the cloud didn't lift, they wouldn't set out until such time as it did lift. For over the tabernacle, a cloud of the Lord rested by day, and a fire would appear in it by night, in the view of all the house of Israel throughout their journeys. And that image of the fire by night and the cloud by day is a way of expressing God's sort of delegation of leadership to natural phenomenon, right? Allow the cloud and the fire to lead people forward, because I can't lead them forward like God doesn't lead them forward quite the same. Now, what Jason said actually was something that I think is really interesting. I thought about that before. Is that the same cloud that holds our files? So the idea that the cloud holds all this information, and I don't know who decided to name it the cloud, but there is something that is in some way poetic about that connection between the cloud, that holds all our information, and the cloud of unknowing and the cloud of God. And the other thing that I wrote about in the Jerusalem Post piece is, as I was writing this, the thing that kept coming back to me, and if you are of a certain generation, probably would have kept coming back to you too, is the Joni Mitchell song, I've looked at clouds from both sides now. And clouds illusions, I recall, I really don't know clouds at all. That's how that ends. And I thought that's actually perfect. I don't know if she was inspired by the Torah, but it's actually perfect, because what you discover, and what I think the Torah in a weird way is trying to say, is here's all this stuff that God wants, that God does, that God expresses, and yet at the end, you don't know God at all. How can you? In the analogy that I've used before, and I think is a really useful and helpful one, when I speak to the high schoolers at the synagogue, I say, look, when you were 2 years old, could you understand what it is to be a 15-year-old? And they all say, no, of course. 2-year-old doesn't know what a 15-year-old is. A 2-year-old doesn't even know what they don't know about being a 15-year-old. And I say, well, in terms of the gap, in terms of the distance between a 2 and a 15-year-old is not as great as the distance between human beings and God. So even that which we think we know that we don't know, we really don't know. And if that sentence was too syntactically tangled, what I'm basically saying is we can't understand enough about God to even figure out what it is that we don't understand about God. We're that far from it. Just like a 2-year-old doesn't know, oh, well, I don't know what it's like to go to school, because they don't even know the basic outline of the world of the 15-year-old. And that's why a cloud is such a wonderful metaphor, because in one way, God is also reachable. The Talmud says God is as close as your mouth is to your ear. In other words, whatever you say, God can hear. So in one sense, God is excruciatingly close. And in fact, we know, even in ancient times, if you went up on the top of a mountain, you could sometimes walk through a cloud. It's not only something that is the advent of an airplane. And yet at the same time, there is something essentially unknowable that a cloud represents that is also true about God and true about the presence of God being on the tabernacle, and the way God works in the world. I'm just looking to see if there are questions. The way God works in the world suggests this. Now, since we're coming up on Purim, just a word about Purim as well, and in one way, the way it ties in to this question. The story of Purim is the story essentially of dependence upon good fortune and skill and a certain opportunism to save the Jewish people, who are ultimately at the disposal of other powers. If Achashverosh had been a different person, if Esther had not been beautiful, if Mordechai had not been astute, the end of the story would have been very different. And there are two ways of looking at this. I want to say there are two ways of looking at this, and one conclusion that is useful to draw from it. The conclusion that is useful to draw from it, which Jews have always drawn, is that in the diaspora, we are always at risk because we don't determine our own fate. But let's put that aside for the moment. One of the ways of drawing this conclusion is that in the old phrase, God works in mysterious ways, that the cloud is there, God's presence is there. Remember that God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. It's the one book of the Bible where God's name is not mentioned. And God is still there. It's just that you don't see the operations of God. There is this cloud that knits together the narrative and the possibilities, but you don't see it. The other is just that you have to take human initiative and use human courage, because without it, you're lost. Remember what Mordechai says to Esther. She's terrified to go to the king because she thinks he may kill her. And he says, but maybe for this moment you were born. And I have to say, without getting too topical or too off topic, if someone wants to say that to Zelensky, I would say that fits very, very nicely. Maybe for this moment you were born. Life sometimes calls us to missions and to events that we have that we have no idea about, and that can happen. That all of a sudden we are mandated to help in a way that we could not otherwise imagine. And maybe this is part of what it means to have God's presence among us. It is to be called in some certain way. We do know in the sense that God is in everything, darkness and light, says Marla. I agree with that. I mean, it is certainly true, but it's also interesting to see how God's presence feels different in different things and in different places. And then Sandy says, if the cloud is a substitute of sorts for a more direct divine presence, is the cloud. Recall Exodus 33, when God, still angry at the people, says, I won't go in your midst. So yeah, it does feel like a cloud it's not a substitute, I would say a symbol maybe of the fact that God is in their midst because the cloud is there and God hasn't abandoned them. yes, it is certainly possible that we don't fully understand the ways in which we can connect to God, because, as you say, we are unable to use all of our capacities as human beings. And the holiday of Purim and the narrative that is part of the holiday, is at the center of the holiday, the Megillah, is one of the ways that you draw close to God, at least in the Jewish tradition, is by telling the story. Because when you tell the story of God's influence and presence and closeness through Jewish history, when you read the Torah, when you chant the Megillah, when you tell the story, that is a way of bringing God's presence closer, even though I grant you, if I said, tell me 5 ways to bring God's presence closer, one of your answers might not be, oh, tell a story. But in the Jewish tradition, that is very much the case, that the story itself, because that's after all what Torah is a ladder as well as a narrative, and changes the way we relate to and see the world, which is also what ritual is supposed to do. Right, lighting Shabbos candles, you feel closer to God. And the other important thing to say about this and about the cloud is that the cloud is part of if you talk directionally, the cloud is part of the idea that there is a bi-directional dynamic to religious life. That is, human beings ascend and God descends. And now we're thinking spatially, and obviously spatial thinking is not exactly applicable to God. But the Torah does talk about God coming down. And when you light Shabbos candles, you feel like your soul is elevated, but also you feel like you bring the presence of God among you. And yeah, I think, Corey, that you're right, that the cloud could very easily be a metaphor, not very easily, but probably is a metaphor for processes that we just don't understand and for things that are not clear to us. And that is part of what God is supposed to be. After all, God says explicitly in the Torah, you can't know me. You can't understand. My ways are far beyond yours, in the words of the prophet. And so the cloud helps us emotionally attune to being close to something we can't understand, which is not usually the way human beings work. Understanding usually brings intimacy. Here with God, there is intimacy without understanding, which is why I think most people relate to God on an emotional level far more deeply than they do on an intellectual level, because our intellect is limited in terms of the way we can wrap our heads around who God is. But our sense of being connected, that can be powerful beyond, can surprise us with its power in the right relationship. And obviously for the Jewish community, for the Jewish people, being in a relationship with God is the right relationship. So I know that we've packed a lot of stuff into this. We talked about Purim, we talked about Ukraine, we talked about cloud and God. And I'm not sure that this has all been a perfectly coherent package. And I'm willing to plead guilty to the somewhat dissociated nature of the class this morning. But I hope at least it has been suggestive about the ways in which we think about God and the narrative. Misha Nichnas Adar, when Adar starts, you're supposed to have simcha, you're supposed to have joy. So these are not easy times for the world, and they're not easy times for us. But I am hopeful that there will be joy. And I will leave you just with this thought that I also did post this morning, and that I think is really very powerful. I had spoken last week about the fact that, Ukraine's history, and now there is a state of Israel, and that's different. I said, and I promise you that, like you're about to see, there are going to be refugees. They're going to need somewhere to go. And thank God now there's a state of Israel, and that's where they'll go. And sure enough, this morning I read an article about 100 refugees who were taken in by the state of Israel. And I quoted Robert Frost's definition of home, that home is the place where when you have to go there, they have to take you in. And in that sense, for the Jewish people, Israel is truly a home. When these people had to go there because they were fleeing Ukraine and persecution, Israel had to take them in. That's the mission of the state. So amidst all the tumult and pain and difficulty, let us also feel blessed that we live in a time when, come Purim, not only will we be celebrating it in the diaspora, as it happened in the diaspora, but our sisters and brothers will be celebrating it in Eretz Yisrael. So I hope you have a Chag Purim Sameach, a happy Purim, and I look forward to seeing you on Shabbat morning, when we will talk more about lots of things.